Welcome to At Home with Music. I'm Leon Olguin, or as my young students call me, Mr. O. Have you ever listened to a song and something in the chord progression surprised you? Maybe it caught you a little bit off guard. And you found yourself wondering, well, how did the songwriter, how did the composer make it sound interesting? What did they do to that chord progression? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. In a previous video, I talked about parallel keys. So you remember how every major key not only has a relative minor, but a parallel minor as well. So for example, the parallel minor of G major is G minor. We're using natural minor here for our example. Now this led me to briefly introduce the concept of borrowed chords. So you can take a chord progression that's in a particular key and add a chord that is borrowed from the parallel key. So you might be in a major key and you borrow a chord from the parallel minor, or vice versa. So you could take a chord progression like this C major chord progression, C, F, G, and C, and change it to something like this: F minor, G, C. The F minor chord is borrowed from the parallel minor of C major. So what songwriters and composers often use in order to make their chord progressions interesting, in order to give you that little bit of a surprise, in order to create that harmonic surprise, they use borrowed chords. Now, this concept of borrowed chords is sometimes referred to as modal interchange, which is kind of a cool way to refer to it. And there are a few other names that musicians and songwriters use, but we're going to stick with the term borrowed chords because really that's what we're doing. We're going to take a chord, a series of chords from one key, and when we're writing a chord progression, we're going to borrow chords from that parallel key. So a borrowed chord is basically a chord borrowed from the parallel key. It creates a harmonic switch that you're not prepared for. It can make a dull chord progression suddenly sound interesting and surprising. Borrowed chords are often used as color chords. They provide harmonic color. Incidentally, you can also borrow chords from other parallel modes besides major and minor. So for example, you could be playing in the Dorian mode and then suddenly borrow a chord from D major. So there, I was playing in the Dorian mode and I borrowed a D major chord from a major mode. Now, borrowed chords can be distinguished from modulation. What they do is create a harmonic switch, but it doesn't last long enough to be called a modulation. It's a borrowed chord, and then we return to the original key that we're in. So say, for example, we're in C major, we borrow a chord from the C minor scale, C minor chords, but we stay in C major. Now, borrowed chords can be used to create modulations, but that's something we're going to cover in a future video. Right now, let's consider borrowed chords that are used to add color to a chord progression, but we stay in the same key. Like many musical concepts, this is one of those big can of worms that we are opening when we consider all the possibilities when it comes to borrowed chords. So consequently, we're not going to try and cover everything here in this one video because basically there's enough here to create an entire course on borrowed chords. This video would become incredibly long, and I think you'll see why as we continue on. But let's start very simple. We're going to start in the key of C major and its parallel minor. So you remember how the C major scale can be used to create chords. Most likely you are familiar with the process for doing this. And you can also go to the parallel minor of C major, which of course is C minor, and using the natural minor scale, we find these chords. So if you're playing in C major, those chords that are formed from the C minor scale are potential borrowed chords. And of course, it goes the other way. If you're playing in C minor, you could potentially borrow chords from C major. I would like to briefly show you the most common borrowed chords that you're going to come across. Now, if we are playing in a minor key, the most common borrowed chord is known as the Picardy third. I mentioned this in the previous video when I was talking about parallel keys, and I used as my example an early Elton John song. He was actually in the key of E minor. And then the last chord of the song is E major, the parallel major key of E minor. That's the Picardy third. That's the most common borrowed chord when you're playing in a minor key. In a major key, you actually have several choices. So for example, and I've used this example before, you could borrow the minor 4 from C minor, which would be F minor. And so you can create a chord progression like this, which I've played before. You can also use the flat 6. It's called the flat 6 in C major, but it is a chord that you find in the key of C minor. And so you can end up with a chord progression like this. You could also use what in C major would be called the flat 3. It's just the 3 chord in C minor. You could also use the flat 7 chord in C major, which is actually B flat, once again, borrowed from C natural minor. There's the 7 chord. You could even do something like this. So up till now, we've only been using 3-note chords, but we can make this quite a bit more interesting if we start using 7th chords. So, for example, if we build a 7th chord on each note of the C major scale, we end up with C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G 7, A minor 7, and this is B minor 7 flat 5. And then in the parallel minor, once again using natural minor as our basis, we have C minor 7, D minor 7 flat 5, E flat major 7, F minor 7, G minor 7, A flat major 7, and B flat 7. And now we're back. So you could do a chord progression like this. Or like this. Or something like this. Just a few examples there. We have really just scratched the surface. We're actually just getting started when it comes to borrowed chords. There's a lot more we can say, a lot more we can do with this, but I just wanted to give you a little taste, a little introduction. We'll deal with this more in a future video. But for now, see if you can spot the borrowed chords in your favorite songs. Listen to your favorite songs, and if you hear what sounds like a borrowed chord, let me know about it in the comments. Let me know what song you're listening to. And especially some older tunes, songs from the 60s and 70s, even in the 80s. You'll hear those harmonic surprises, and they usually occur because the songwriter or the composer used a borrowed chord. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, if you happen to listen to a song that you think has borrowed chords in it, let me know what song it is. I'd be very curious. And then maybe we can explore what borrowed chords they were using in that particular song. I look forward to speaking to you in the next one. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't subscribed already.